The rain had a way of making Portland feel lonelier than it really was. On that particular Tuesday, it came down in slow, stubborn sheets, painting the sidewalks a dull silver and leaving Ethan Miller alone on his porch, watching droplets gather and slide down the rusted railing of the old house he once promised he would never live in again. 10 years ago, Ethan was the kind of man you read about in business magazines. Founder and CEO of Greentrail Travel, a sustainable tourism startup that rose like wildfire after its viral documentary on ethical eco-travel. He had everything: awards, investors, a stunning condo downtown, and the kind of charisma that made people believe in impossible things. But the pandemic had been cruel. It clipped airline wings and shuttered dreams.
One by one, Ethan's partner pulled out.
Then the lawsuits came. Investors demanded accountability.
Friends disappeared.
By the time the dust settled, all Ethan had left was the home his parents left him, a narrow 2-story in southeast Portland, shaded by overgrown maples and memories he never asked for. He hadn't meant to stop caring, not entirely. But apathy was a quiet thief, and in the stillness of loss, it was easier to let go than to fight.
Morning blurred into night.
He rarely left the house except to pick up groceries or walk aimlessly around the block, convincing himself that tomorrow he might try harder. That evening, as the wind turned sharp and the scent of wet leaves hung in the air, Ethan sat on the porch sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug. That's when he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Thin, wiry, with tangled dark hair poking out from beneath a faded hoodie. She was sitting at the far end of the street bench, curled up like a question mark, her knees tucked into her chest. Next to her was a plastic bag, the kind grocery stores give for free when you forget your reusable ones, stuffed with something Ethan couldn't make out. She had a stack of scratch tickets in one hand and a cheap pen in the other. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She just sat there, eyes watching the rain as if waiting for it to end. Something about her stopped him. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was how everyone else walked past her, like she was invisible. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in months, Ethan saw someone who looked as lost as he felt. He stood up, hesitated, then walked down the steps and across the sidewalk. She didn't move. "Hey," he said gently.
"You want to come sit under the porch? You're gonna catch a cold out here."
She turned her head slightly, suspicious. Her eyes were startlingly clear, green sharp, and too old for her face. "Why?" she asked.
Ethan shrugged.
"Because it's warmer. And I've got an extra blanket and maybe some peanut butter crackers." That got a reaction. A flicker of hesitation, then she stood slowly, picking up her plastic bag and walking with cautious steps toward him. He stepped aside, letting her climb the porch. She sat on the far end, close enough to stay dry but far enough to bolt if she needed to. He went inside, rummaged through the cabinet, and came back with the crackers and a clean towel. "Here," he offered. "At least dry off." She stared at him for a second before taking the towel. "You live alone?" she asked while wiping her face.
"Yeah," Ethan said, sitting back down. "Just me and the rein."
"You're not scared I'll rob you or something?"
Ethan let out a dérigre.
"No offense, but I think if you wanted to steal something, you'd pick a better house. I'm about as broke as it gets."
She cracked a smile, a small, fleeting thing.
"Same." They sat in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward but filled with unspoken stories. After a while, Ethan asked, "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said.
"Sophie Carter."
"Well, Sophie Carter," he said. "I'm Ethan."
"Are you gonna call the comm?"
"Should I?" She shook her head. "Not unless you want them to take me away." "And where would they take you?" "Group home, maybe. Or foster care. I've been through a few." Ethan nodded, letting the quiet return. She nibbled at the crackers, slowly at first, then like someone who hadn't eaten since yesterday. It was only supposed to be one night. He offered her the couch, gave her an old sweatshirt to sleep in, and told himself it was temporary.
"In the morning, et they figure something out. Maybe call Someone."
Maybe drive her to the local shelter. But when he walked into the living room at dawn, he saw her curled up, blanket tucked to her chin, breathing softly like someone finally allowed to sleep without fear. And something inside him shifted. He made scrambled eggs. Burnt them a little, but she didn't complain. "Got any juice?" she asked. "Nope."
Just tapoter en leftove instant coffee.
Coffee's gross, she said, wrinkling her nose. Ethan smiled. Yeah, it is. After breakfast, she offered to sweep the porch. Then she organized the junk drawer in the kitchen without being asked. Then she started pointing out things that didn't work, flickering bulbs, broken cabinet hinges. Ethan watched her like a man watching a small precise storm move through his house. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't talk much. But every now and then, she'd say something that made him pause. Do you ever wish you could go back to before everything fell apart? She asked one afternoon while folding towels. All the time, Ethan replied without thinking. She nodded. Me too. But I guess it's not how math works, right?
Quatre ou invariable.
He blinked.
You like math. Sophie shrugged.
It's the only thing that makes sense. People lie.
Number don't.
That line, delivered with the calmness of someone who had already seen too much, lodged in his mind. That night, after she went to sleep, Ethan found himself looking through old notebooks and high school math problems, just to test a theory. The next morning, he asked her casually, Hey Sophie. If I bought 10 boxes of crackers for $2.50 each, how much would I spend? $25, she said instantly, without looking up. And if I had a coupon for 15% off? $21.25, she replied. He stared at her. She stared back. What? She asked. Too slow. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed, really laughed, in what felt like years. And just like that, Ethan Miller, the man who had lost everything, found a reason to start again. Not because he had money, or fame, or even a plan. But because somewhere between the raindrops and the math problems, a little girl with no one else had wandered onto his porch and reminded him what it felt like to matter. Over the next few days, Sophie Carter settled into Ethan's quiet, cluttered world with an ease that surprised them both. She never asked how long she could stay, never asked for anything more than a place to sleep and something to eat. She didn't press Ethan about his past, and she offered very little of her own. There was an unspoken agreement between them, no questions, no pressure, just shared space and quiet coexistence. Ethan wasn't sure when he began looking forward to the soft sound of her footsteps in the morning or the way she silently cleaned up after herself, as if afraid to leave a trace. She moved like someone who had learned to be invisible, and Ethan found that deeply unsettling.
No child should move like that.
No child should carry herself with that kind of silence. One afternoon, he came home from picking up groceries and found her sitting on the floor in the hallway, rearranging a mess of paper clips, broken pens, and rubber bands from the old junk drawer into neat little piles. She was humming softly under her breath. You organizing my chaos? He asked, placing the bag of bread and canned soup on the kitchen counter. She looked up and gave him a half smile. It was driving me crazy. Why do you keep 3 dead batteries and a spoon with a bent handle? Because I'm an optimist. Someday they might be useful. She smirked. That's not optimism. That's hoarding. Ethan laughed, then leaned against the doorframe, watching her work.
You ever go to school, Sophie?
I used to, she said, her voice casual. But moving around so much. It's hard. I missed a lot.
You like it?
School? She shrugged. Some of it. I like learning. Not so much the people. Ethan considered her words. What about math? You seemed pretty quick the other day. She nodded. Math's easy. Clean. It doesn't lie. That line again, short, sharp, and far too knowing. He grabbed a piece of junk mail off the counter and scribbled a problem on the back.
All right, genius. Let's test that. What is 97 times 86?
She stared at the paper for a few seconds, not writing anything down. 8,342, she said. He checked it on his phone. She was right. He sat down on the floor across from her.
Okay, Sophie.
Where did you learn that? Libraries. You can hang out for hours, and no one kicks you out if you look busy. And you just taught yourself? I listened in on classes sometimes. Followed people into public tutoring sessions. Watched YouTube when I had Wi-Fi. Took notes from textbooks left behind at shelters. It wasn't pride in her voice. It wasn't even defiance. It was just fact.
Acquiert record of survival.
You're something else, he murmured. She looked away. People don't usually say that like it's a good thing. He was silent for a long moment. Then, well, I mean it as a good thing. She didn't respond, but he saw the corners of her mouth twitch. That night, as Sophie read an old math workbook Ethan had found in the attic, he sat at the kitchen table staring at his laptop. For the first time in months, he opened his email. Then he typed Portland Math Tutors Volunteer into the search bar. Then Gifted Children Evaluation. He didn't even know what he was looking for yet. All he knew was this girl on his couch, wearing one of his old hoodies and pencil marked up to her elbows, had a mind that didn't belong on the streets. The next morning, he drove her across town to a local community center that offered free educational testing for underprivileged youth. He told her they were just checking something out. I don't need a test, she muttered as they walked in. You might not. But maybe the world does, he said gently. They met with a counselor named Janet, who specialized in assessing cognitive strengths in children from unstable backgrounds. She wore thick glasses, spoke in calm tones, and treated Sophie with the kind of respect Ethan wasn't used to seeing adults give to kids in worn-out sneakers. Janet ran a few basic aptitude assessments, while Ethan waited in the hallway. 20 minutes in, Janet poked her head out and waved him in. She finished all 3 sets, she said. In half the expected time.
With perfect accuracy.
Ethan raised an eyebrow. Is that normal?
Janet shook her head slowly.
It's extraordinary. Sophie sat with her arms crossed, trying not to look pleased. Would you be open to some advanced placement testing? Janet asked Sophie directly. No pressure, of course. Sophie hesitated, then glanced at Ethan. He gave her a small nod. Okay, she said quietly. Over the next week, things began to change. Ethan signed Sophie up for weekend testing sessions. He bought her new notebooks and a calculator with what little money he had left. He found her old textbooks at thrift stores. Every time she solved a problem, her eyes lit up, not with arrogance but relief. Like math was the one place she didn't have to guess what people meant. But not everyone was thrilled. Word spread in the neighborhood. A few neighbors began whispering. An older man across the street, who used to nod politely, now eyed Ethan with suspicion. A woman 2 houses down asked pointedly, "Is she your niece or something?" "No," Ethan replied. "Just a kid who needed a place to stay." Her eyebrows rose. "You sure you're not trying to play savior?" Ethan didn't answer. The comments didn't stop there. At the grocery store, someone murmured something about stray kids being trouble. At the library, a clerk stared too long when Ethan helped Sophie check out books on calculus. Sophie noticed. "Maybe I shouldn't go to those tests," she said one night. "Why?" "People don't like me being here." "Since when do we care what people like?" he said, a little too sharply. Sophie lowered her eyes. "Since always." Ethan exhaled and sat beside her on the couch. "Look, kid. I don't care what they think.
You're brilliant. You're kind.
You're trying.
And you belong here."
She looked at him then, really looked. Even if I wasn't good at math, would I still belong? He blinked. "Of course," he said. "Why would you even ask that?" She didn't answer. Just turned her face away and said softly, "That's not always how it works." He didn't sleep well that night. That question echoed in his head again and again. Would I still belong? It was the kind of question that made him realize just how much the world had already failed her. The following week unfolded like the beginning of something Ethan couldn't name, but couldn't stop either. Sophie had become a part of the house, the rhythm, the quiet hum of mornings filled with the scrape of chairs and the rustle of notebook pages. It felt natural, dangerously so. As if this was how things were always supposed to be. Ethan caught himself rearranging the kitchen so Sophie could reach things more easily. He bought apples and peanut butter crackers without needing to ask if she liked them. He even found himself walking down aisles at the thrift store looking for oversized hoodies and books with colorful math puzzles. One afternoon, while reorganizing some of his old storage boxes in the attic, Ethan stumbled upon a dusty cardboard container labeled, "College Notes." Inside were binders filled with scribbled equations, outdated programming printouts, and his old Texas Instruments calculator, still functional. He brought it downstairs and handed it to Sophie without a word. She examined it carefully, pressing a few buttons, then nodded.
Cool.
This one's better than the cheap ones at the shelter.
You were at a shelter?
For a while, she said casually, not looking up.
Till some stuff happened. Then I wasn't. Ethan didn't press.
He had learned that Sophie offered information like puzzle pieces, out of order, sometimes missing, always deliberate. That evening, he invited Ms. Ramirez over. She arrived with a folder under her arm and a skeptical expression.
You said it was urgent.
Come in, Ethan said, stepping aside. When she saw Sophie sitting at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, notebook open, Ms. Ramirez froze.
This is the girl you mentioned, she asked quietly.
Yes. Sophie looked up, curious but guarded. Ms. Ramirez set down her folder and pulled out a printed math assessment sheet.
She slid it toward Sophie. Would you mind trying a few of these problems for me?
Sophie scanned the page, picked up her pencil, and began to write. Her strokes were fast but precise, and within 10 minutes, she'd completed the entire set. Ms. Ramirez checked the answers silently. Her brows furrowed deeper with every line. Finally, she set the paper down and looked at Ethan.
She didn't just get them right.
She applied methods 2 grade levels above what the questions were designed for.
Sophie shrugged.
I didn't like the way they worded the last one.
Too vague.
Ms. Ramirez smiled, impressed. You don't just solve equations. You challenge them.
Sophie looked up. Is that bad?
On the contrary, Ms. Ramirez said. It's the kind of thing most adults forget how to do. They spent the next hour going through more advanced problems. Sophie never hesitated, and when she did pause, it wasn't from confusion, it was from analyzing if there was a better way.
A more elegant solution.
After Sophie excused herself to the living room, Ms. Ramirez turned to Ethan.
She's gifted, she said, almost in a whisper.
And not just in the way schools define it. She's one of those minds that don't come around often.
I figured as much, Ethan said. What now?
She needs structure.
Challenge. Opportunity.
If she stays in the shadows, she'll disappear.
And that would be a tragedy.
Ethan leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose.
I don't even have legal guardianship. I don't know anything about the process.
And frankly, I can't even pay for my own bills, let alone some elite tutoring program.
I'll make some calls, Ms. Ramirez said firmly. There are scholarships. Community funds.
There's even a citywide math competition in 6 weeks. If she wins that, doors open. Ethan glanced toward the living room, where Sophie sat cross-legged, reading silently.
She's never had doors before, he said.
Well, Ms. Ramirez replied, standing, maybe it's time someone held one open. That night, Ethan told Sophie about the math competition.
Her eyes narrowed. A contest? Like with people watching? Yes. Pass. Sophie. I don't like crowds.
It's not about the crowd. It's about showing people what you can do. It's about proving something.
She looked at him flatly. To who?
Them?
Or you? The question univie.
Neither, he said eventually.
To yourself.
She didn't answer, but she didn't say no either. In the following days, Sophie's behavior subtly changed.
She studied more.
Asked harder questions. She filled notebook after notebook with practice problems. Ethan, without being asked, quizzed her after dinner. They turned it into a game.
Every correct answer earned a point.
Every wrong one led to Ethan having to do push-ups, which amused her endlessly. But beneath the laughter, something else stirred. One night, as Ethan was locking up, he noticed Sophie sitting by the window, staring at the street outside.
Her expression was unreadable. Something on your mind? He asked. She didn't turn. I saw a woman earlier. Across the street. She looked like someone I used to know. But then she turned, and it wasn't her. Someone from your family? Maybe.
Ethan sat down beside.
You remember them?
Bit en pièce. A man who smelt like cigarette. A woman who criait allô.
A cat named Pluto. That's all.
That is not nothing.
She shrugged. They're ghosts. That's how it works when people leave you. Ethan stayed silent. What could he say? That not all people leave? He wasn't sure that was true. He had left people. People had left him. Maybe it was just part of being human. The next day, a social worker knocked on Ethan's door. Someone had reported a strange man living with a young girl. Ethan answered every question, showed every piece of correspondence, and tried not to let his hands shake. Sophie stood behind him, her small frame rigid with anxiety. After the worker left, she didn't say a word. She went into the bedroom and closed the door.
Ethan knocked softly.
Hey. It's okay. No, it's not, came her voice, muffled but clear. They'll come again. They always do. Then we'll be ready next time. Why are you doing this? She asked.
Et hésitait-elle.
Because I want you to have a shot, he said. Because someone should have given you that already. There was a long pause.
Then, don't disappear, Ethan.
His throat tightened. I won't, he whispered.
I'm not going anywhere.
He meant it. For the first time in years, he meant something.
The day of the citywide math competition arrived with a crisp wind that swept through the streets of Portland like a reminder that time didn't stop for anyone, not even little girls who used to sleep under bus shelters.
Ethan woke early, nerves stretched taut.
He cooked scrambled eggs and toast, poured orange juice into mismatched mugs, and placed Sophie's plate on the table with the kind of precision usually reserved for holiday dinners. She entered the kitchen wearing a second-hand hoodie and jeans that Ethan had found at a thrift store just a few days prior. Her backpack, frayed at the straps, was slung over one shoulder.
She looked calm. Too calm.
You slept okay?
Ethan asked. Sophie nodded.
Fine.
You ready? She glanced at the clock. Let's just get it over with. In the car, she stared out the window, silent.
Ethan tried to fill the space with casual talk, something light to ease the weight, but every word felt forced.
He could feel it, the pressure.
Not from the competition, but from everything riding on it.
The recognition.
The potential future.
The possibility that this one day could shift everything Sophie knew about her place in the world. The competition was held in a clean, well-lit auditorium inside a private prep school nestled in the West Hills. Everything about the building screamed money: polished wood floors, curated art on the walls, and students dressed in matching blazers and khakis. Parents clustered in small groups, murmuring in low voices, casting sideways glances at Ethan and Sophie as they walked in.
Some expressions were curious. Others skeptical.
One woman leaned toward another and whispered, not quietly enough, "That must be the street kid everyone's talking about."
Sophie kept walking, eyes fixed straight ahead. Ethan felt the anger rise in his chest.
He wanted to turn around, say something, but Sophie beat him to it, with silence.
Her back straightened, chin lifted. She didn't need him to defend her. Not today.
They signed in at the check-in table. Sophie was assigned a seat at the very back of the auditorium, table number 37. Most of the other kids were accompanied by tutors or anxious parents with flashcards and water bottles.
Ethan handed her a sharpened pencil and squeezed her shoulder.
Just Brett. Do what you do.
She nodded without looking up. Thanks for staying. Always.
The proctor called for all students to take their seats. Ethan watched as Sophie disappeared into the sea of polished shoes and expensive backpacks. From the back of the auditorium, she looked small, but not lost. The competition lasted 2 hours. Ethan waited outside with the other parents, pacing by the vending machine, sipping bad coffee from a styrofoam cup. He thought about the first time he saw Sophie, sitting under the bus shelter, clutching her scratch tickets like armor. He thought about the question she had asked him, would I still belong if I wasn't good at math? And he realized just how unfair the world had been to her. No child should have to earn love with numbers. When the doors finally opened, students filed out one by one, some with relieved faces, others clearly shaken. Sophie walked toward him slowly, her expression unreadable.
Well? Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I finished everything, she said. And I think I did okay. Just okay. She smirked.
They made the mistake of including a proof I already solved in the library workbook 2 weeks ago.
So yeah, okay.
He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding.
Pro of you, kid. Even if he failed.
Especially if you failed. A week passed. Then another.
Sophie went back to her routine, solving equations on napkins, fixing Ethan's budgeting spreadsheets, writing down little formulas in chalk on the garage wall.
She seemed at peace, but Ethan knew she was waiting. He was too.
Then one afternoon, Ms. Ramirez called.
She won, she said without preamble. Not just first place. She scored the highest in the past 10 years.
Ethan blinked. Are you serious?
She solved the final question in a way the judges hadn't even considered.
They want to meet her. Newspapers are calling. It's going to get loud, Ethan.
He looked toward the living room, where Sophie sat with a Rubik's Cube, half solved.
Yelel Teller.
He did.
And for the first time since he met her, Sophie cried.
It wasn't dramatic.
Just a few tears that rolled down her cheeks as she sat on the porch steps, the cube forgotten in her lap.
They saw me, she whispered. Finally.
From that moment on, everything changed. The local newspaper ran a feature, Homeless Girl Wins City Math Competition. The photo showed Sophie in her thrift store clothes, holding the trophy with an uncertain smile.
Overnight, people wanted to know more. Donations came in. Private schools reached out with scholarship offers. Organizations offered mentorship.
And most unsettling of all, strangers began showing up.
Some brought flowers. Others brought questions. How did she end up on the streets? Who's her real family? Is the man she lives with her father?
Ethan tried to shield her from most of it. He turned down interviews, avoided reporters, and answered questions with tight-lipped courtesy.
But not everyone could be avoided.
One afternoon, a tall man in a tailored suit knocked on their front door. He introduced himself as Harlan Brooks, an attorney representing a family from San Francisco.
He pulled out a photo.
A younger Sophie, maybe 3 years old, with shorter hair and a dimpled smile.
Standing between two adults in a sunny backyard.
We believe she is the biological daughter of Jacob and Marissa Carter, he said.
She went missing 7 years ago after a car accident. We've been searching ever since.
Ethanès briscoqued.
Sophie, standing behind him, stared at the photo in silence. Then she said, I don't remember that. You were very young, the attorney said gently.
But your fingerprint match.
And there's a birthmark behind your right shoulder, isn't there? Sophie didn't answer. We're not here to take her away, he added. Not yet.
We just want to talk.
That night, Sophie sat on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees.
Ethan brought her a blanket, draped it over her shoulders. Do you believe them? She asked.
I don't know.
What if it's true? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, then we'll take it one step at a time. Sophie looked at him. Would I still live here? That's not up to me. Yes, it is, she said softly. Because if they're my family, then what are you? Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. I'm the guy who'll be here, he said.
No matter what.
The next few days passed in a strange kind of quiet. Not the comfortable silence Ethan and Sophie had grown used to, but something heavier, denser. It clung to the walls of the house, followed them in every room. Sophie stopped drawing math formulas on the garage wall.
She barely touched her notebooks.
Her appetite thinned, and so did her laughter. Ethan tried to carry on as if everything was normal, but even he couldn't pretend for long. The folder left by Harlan Brooks, the lawyer, sat unopened on the kitchen counter for 2 days before Ethan finally worked up the nerve to open it. Inside were documents, DNA results, a birth certificate, news clippings, and missing person flyers from years ago. All of it pointed to one truth. Sophie Carter wasn't just a name she'd chosen to survive. It was her real name. And someone had been looking for her. He sat on the edge of the couch, the file open in his lap, watching Sophie from across the room. She was curled into a corner, her eyes scanning the TV screen without really watching. When she noticed his gaze, she turned the volume up, not to hear better, but to drown something out. They want to meet you, Ethan said quietly. I know. They're flying up from San Francisco next week.
Just to talk. No legal move. No pressure. She said nothing.
You don't have to do anything you don't want to. You know that, right?
Stille, non serre.
He closed the file and set it aside.
Sophie.
Her eyes didn't leave the screen. Do you want me to go with them? The question stunned him. What?
You heard me.
I didn't. I don't want you to do anything for me.
This is your life. Your choice.
She finally turned toward him. But it's not. If they're my real parents, doesn't that make this temporary? No, Ethan said, firmer than he intended. You're not alone. You're not on trial here. You're a kid who's been through more than anyone ever should. And you deserve the truth, but you also deserve love.
Real love.
From whoever can give it. That's not something DNA guarantees. She looked away again, lips pressed tight. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at a neutral location, a family mediation center downtown with glass walls and beige carpets.
Ethan drove Sophie there in silence.
She held a worn Rubik's Cube in her lap, turning it absent-mindedly. Are you scared? He asked, parking the car. She nodded. A little. He reached over and gently squeezed her hand.
Yelel biraik tutsid.
They entered the building together. A receptionist led Sophie into a private room while Ethan stayed behind. Through a small pane of glass, he could see a man and a woman already seated inside. The man was tall, sharply dressed, with gray at his temples and a rigid posture. The woman wore a cream sweater and held a tissue in both hands. Her eyes were red, but her smile trembled with hope. Sophie stepped in. She didn't rush. She didn't run. Ethan sat in the hallway, listening to the minutes drag by. 30, 40, an hour. When the door finally opened, Sophie walked out slowly. Her expression was unreadable. How did it go? Ethan asked. She shrugged. They're nice, I guess. They cried a lot. That makes sense. They showed me baby pictures. Told me about my room. My cat.
Plutôt.
You remember any of it? Some. Not really. Do you want to see them again?
I don't know. They redom in silence.
That night, Sophie said little, only retreating to her room after dinner. Ethan sat at the table long after she was gone, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. If, despite everything, biology would win. The next morning, Ethan found Sophie sitting on the front steps, bundled in a blanket, her breath visible in the chilly air. They offered to take me to San Francisco, she said. He nodded. I figured. They have a guest house. A private school picked out. A tutor. They said I'd have a real chance. And how do you feel about that?
I don't know.
He sat beside her. They said I'm lucky to have survived. That they never gave up. But, they didn't ask about you.
Ethan blinked.
What do you mean? They never asked who I'd been with. Who helped me? Who taught me math? Who made sure I didn't freeze to death last winter? Ethan stayed quiet. I know they lost something. I know I did too. But they're strangers. And you're not. He took a slow breath.
Sophie, what were you chose?
I'll support it. If you go with them, it won't change how I feel.
Yelel stibir. Yelel stiker.
That doesn't stop just because they showed up. She nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the street.
What if I don't belong anywhere?
You belong, Ethan said. With people who see you. Not just as a daughter or a genius. But as Sophie. She didn't cry. Not then. But that night, Ethan found a note folded on his nightstand in small, careful handwriting. I don't want to be a prize they found. I want to be a person they know.
And beneat det.
Thank you for letting me be real. The following week, the Carters requested another meeting. This time, they brought their attorney. Ethan agreed, reluctantly. They met again at the mediation center. Mr. Carter sat straighter this time. More composed. Mrs. Carter smiled, but there was something more practiced about it. We've thought a lot about what's best for Sophie, Mr. Carter said. And we'd like to take her home. We can provide everything she needs. Ethan nodded. She knows. We'd like her to come with us immediately. We've already arranged her school enrollment. Ethan frowned.
You mean, now?
Mrs. Carter leaned forward.
We believe it's important for her development to be in a stable environment as soon as possible.
Ethan felt a pulse of heat rise in his chest. And if she's not ready? She's a minor, Mr. Carter said gently. Legally, we are still her parents. Ethan looked at Sophie. She was silent, eyes lowered. Then she spoke. I don't want to go yet. The room fell silent. Mrs. Carter's expression flickered.
Sweetheart, we just want what is best for you.
Then let me choose, Sophie said. Not now.
Not like this.
Harlan Brooks cleared his throat. There is a path for shared custody or extended transition, if both parties agree. Ethan nodded. Then that's what we'll do.
The Carters exchanged a glance, clearly unhappy, but eventually agreed. As they left the center, Ethan looked at Sophie.
Are you okay?
She nodded. They're trying. I think they really are.
But I'm not ready to leave behind the person I became here.
He smiled. That's a good person to be. And for now, that was enough.
The temporary agreement with the Carters brought an odd calm to Ethan's home, though it was the kind of calm that made you question when the storm would return.
Sophie resumed her studies, quieter but more focused.
She split her time between Ethan's house and weekend visits with her biological parents, though it was clear she hadn't yet settled into either place with certainty. The Carters, despite their pristine presentation, seemed to move with urgency, an eagerness to speed up the transition that made Ethan uneasy. They enrolled Sophie in virtual prep classes, hired an educational consultant, and even contacted a private boarding school overseas. Ethan only found out when Sophie handed him a glossy brochure that had been tucked into her backpack. They want me to visit this school in France over the summer, she said flatly.
For a full academic immersion.
Ethan scanned the brochure.
Photos of ancient stone buildings, state-of-the-art labs, and rows of students in uniforms filled the pages.
It looked impressive. It also looked like somewhere a child could disappear. What do you think? He asked.
Sophie shrugged.
They keep saying it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But they never ask if I want to go. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he kept the brochure and promised to do a little research. That night, he couldn't sleep.
There had always been something nagging at him. Not just the speed of the Carters' involvement, but the glossiness of their narrative, the curated story, the perfect answers. Ethan had learned, after everything he'd been through, that real life was rarely that clean. The next morning, he called Ms. Ramirez. Do you still have that friend who works in child welfare? He asked.
I do, she replied cautiously. Why?
Can you help me find anything from when Sophie disappeared?
I just want to make sure.
I'm not missing something.
She hesitated. You think they're hiding something?
I don't know.
But I can't ignore my gut.
2 days later, Ms. Ramirez sent him a PDF with the subject line, confidential.
For your eyes only.
Ethan opened it in the middle of the night, alone in the kitchen. The file was a scan of a child protection report from 7 years earlier. It described an emergency call made by a neighbor, claiming to hear shouting and objects being thrown from the Carter residence. The report noted suspected child endangerment, emotional abuse, and volatile behavior between the parents. A social worker had been assigned, but before a full investigation could be completed, the Carters reported a car accident in the mountains that had supposedly taken Sophie's life. Her body had never been recovered, but due to the presumed fatality and media pressure, the investigation was closed without further action.
Ethan sat there, stunned. He read the report again, then a third time. His hands were shaking. They hadn't just lost her. They might have driven her away. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he called the Carters. Marissa answered, her voice bright and cordial. Ethan.
How are you?
We need to talk, he said, trying to steady his voice. In person.
They met that evening at a coffee shop downtown. Jacob Carter was calm as always, with that smooth, polished demeanor that reminded Ethan of corporate meetings and rehearsed smiles.
Marissa looked anxious but polite. Ethan slid the printed report across the table. Jacob didn't blink. Marissa's hand went to her mouth.
What is this?
Jacob asked, voice cold.
You tell me.
This report is outdated. Irrelevant. It's not irrelevant, Ethan said. It's the environment Sophie came from.
Jacob leaned forward.
That was a very difficult time. We were grieving. We had just lost our daughter. You reported her dead before the investigation could be completed, Ethan interrupted. You shut everything down and disappeared from scrutiny. And now, 7 years later, you expect her to re-enter your lives like none of that matters. Jacob didn't speak. Marissa finally did. We made mistakes, she said softly. We fought. We were overwhelmed. But we never stopped loving her. Love isn't just grief, Ethan said. It's presence. It's patience. It's staying, even when it's hard. We're trying, Marissa whispered.
Ethan stood up.
Then try harder. Try telling her the truth. Try letting her choose without pressure. Because if you keep forcing her to be the daughter you lost, you'll lose her again. He left the report on the table and walked out. Back at home, Sophie was waiting. You're late, she said. Yeah. I needed to see something through. She studied his face.
Something happened.
He nodded.
Iridafil. About your past.
About what you ran from. She didn't flinch. I remember some of it. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be. They're not who they pretend to be, are they? No, she said. But they're still trying.
Ethan sat beside.
You don't have to go to France if you don't want to. She turned to him.
What if you don't want to go?
What if I want to see what's out there, just for me? Then I'll support you, he said. As long as it's your decision, not theirs. She nodded. But before that, she added, I want to finish the school year here. With Ms. Ramirez. With you. He smiled. We'll make it count. The following week, Sophie declined the French immersion offer. She wrote the school herself.
Tout déslaté, another message came from the quartier.
This time, from their attorney. They wanted full custody, now. They claimed that Ethan was interfering with parental rights. That he had manipulated Sophie. That he was creating unnecessary conflict.
Ethan read the letter 3 times.
Then he looked at Sophie. She stared at the floor. They're going to try to take me. They can't do it that easily. They're rich. They can try anything. He put a hand on her shoulder. Then we'll fight. She looked up. Are you sure? Absolutely. For the first time since that day at the bus stop, Sophie smiled, not with caution, but with conviction. I guess math won't solve this one, she said. No, Ethan replied. But maybe truth will. And that, they both agreed, was worth solving for. 3 days after receiving the letter from the Carters' attorney, Ethan began preparing for what he feared most, a custody battle. There was no court date yet, no official summons, but the intention was clear. The Carters weren't just trying to reconnect with Sophie. They were moving to claim her. Ethan knew he was walking a tightrope. He wasn't Sophie's legal guardian. Everything he'd done, the care, the support, the structure he'd given her, had no weight in a courtroom unless Sophie chose to speak for herself. But she was still a minor, still legally theirs. He reached out to Amanda Price, a child advocacy attorney recommended by Ms. Ramirez. Amanda had handled several high-profile cases where minors pushed for autonomy in deciding their own living arrangements. After reviewing Sophie's situation, she agreed to take the case pro bono. If Sophie wants to stay, Amanda said during their first meeting, I'll do everything in my power to make sure her voice is heard. But we need to act fast. If the Carters file an emergency motion, they could remove her before we get a chance to intervene. Ethan nodded.
She's scared. She knows something is coming.
She's right to be. But even Amanda's warning didn't prepare him for what happened next. It was a Friday afternoon. Ethan had just finished reorganizing the garage when he noticed the house was unusually quiet. He walked into the kitchen, no Sophie. He checked the living room, the backyard, the porch. Gone. Her jacket was missing. So was her worn-out canvas backpack. Ethan's heart slammed in his chest. He called her phone, straight to voicemail. He texted her, no reply. He tried calling the Carters. No answer. He called Ms. Ramirez. She hadn't seen or heard from Sophie. Panic rising, he contacted the police.
Without a court order or proof of wrongdoing, the response was cautious. If her biological parents picked her up, and she went willingly, the officer said, there's not much we can do.
But they didn't tell me. They didn't give any notice.
Do you have legal guardianship?
No, but.
Then I suggest you speak with your attorney.
And file quickly.
Ethan hung up, his hands trembling. He knew Sophie wouldn't leave without telling him, unless she didn't have a choice.
He called Amanda.
I'm going over there, he said. Amanda didn't stop him. The Cotter's temporary rental was a high-rise condo on the riverfront. Ethan buzzed the lobby intercom 3 times before someone finally answered. Mr. Miller, Jacob Cotter's voice came through, calm and clipped.
We're not accepting visitors. I need to see Sophie. She's with her family.
That is all you need to know.
Put her on. Let me hear it from her.
She's tired.
She needs space. I'm asking you politely to walk away. The line went dead.
Ethan stood outside the building for nearly an hour, pacing, staring up at the windows, hoping for a glimpse.
Nothing.
That night was the longest of his life.
He didn't sleep. He barely moved.
Every sound made him check the door. Every minute without a call stretched into panic. By morning, he drafted a full petition for emergency temporary custody with Amanda. But before they could submit it, Sophie returned. It was just past 7 a.m. Ethan opened the door to find her standing on the porch, soaked from the rain, clutching her backpack, her face pale and drawn.
Sophie, he whispered.
She walked inside without a word and dropped onto the couch.
I had to sneak out, she said quietly. They weren't going to let me come back.
Ethan knelt besider. Are you hurt?
No. Just tired. What happened?
She looked at him, eyes glassy. They told me we were going to visit a museum. But they drove me to the airport. Said we had a flight booked to France. That we'd already withdrawn me from school here.
Ethan briscoqued.
They tried to take you out of the country?
They said I needed a fresh start.
That staying here was dangerous.
That you were interfering. Did you agree to go? She shook her head. I begged them to wait.
To let me say goodbye.
They said no.
Her voice trembled. So when they weren't watching, I grabbed my bag and ran.
Got on a city bus. Didn't stop until I was here.
Ethan wrapped a blanket around her shoulders.
You did the right thing.
Sophie looked up at him. Are they going to come back? Are they going to take me anyway?
Not if I can help it.
Amanda filed the petition that same day. They included everything: Sophie's academic records, testimony from Ms. Ramirez, a notarized letter from Sophie herself, the incident at the airport. Amanda argued that removing Sophie without her consent, especially across international borders, constituted a breach of ethical parenting at best and coercion at worst. Within 24 hours, a judge issued a temporary stay order. The Carters were barred from removing Sophie from the state of Oregon until a formal hearing could take place. When Ethan told Sophie the news, she didn't cheer.
She didn't smile.
She just exhaled.
Thank you, she said. For what?
For believing I'm old enough to matter. That night, she didn't sleep on the couch. She asked Ethan if she could sleep in the guest room, with the door open.
I'm not scared, she said. I just don't want to be alone.
You're not, Ethan replied.
Not anymore.
The next morning, she returned to school. Ms. Ramirez hugged her tightly. You have people now, the teacher whispered.
Don't forget that.
And Sophie nodded, not as the girl who once sat silent in the rain, but as someone who knew, finally, that her voice mattered. That her choices counted.
The battle wasn't over.
But for the first time, Sophie had something more than numbers and notebooks. She had ground to stand on. And she wasn't running anymore. The weeks that followed were filled with tense preparations. Amanda worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, preparing Sophie for the formal custody hearing. Sophie spent her afternoons between math studies and long conversations with Ms. Ramirez, who helped her understand what was at stake. Ethan tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, cooking dinners, keeping up with chores, acting like everything wasn't quietly hanging by a thread. The Cotters, meanwhile, made their presence known. They began a media campaign, subtle at first. A few local articles reframed their story. Parents reunite with missing daughter after 7 years.
The pièce peinte d'Em à Heartbroken, dignifié, patient.
There was no mention of the airport incident, no detail about the rushed attempt to remove Sophie from the country. Just polished narratives and perfectly posed photographs. People began to talk. Some neighbors, previously warm, now looked at Ethan with suspicion. He overheard someone at the grocery store say, he should just let her go home. That's her real family. Sophie heard it too. One evening, after dinner, she sat on the back porch, staring at the stars. Why do people think blood is everything? She asked.
Ethan sat besideur.
Because it's easy. It's simple to believe that biology means belonging. But it doesn't.
No.
It doesn't. They didn't know my favorite book. They didn't know I sleep with the closet light on. They didn't even know I hate peanut butter. Ethan smiled. You've never told me that. You never made me eat it either. He looked at her for a long moment. You're allowed to choose, Sophie. No matter what anyone says. But what if the judge doesn't believe me? Then we keep telling the truth. As many times as it takes. The formal hearing was scheduled for mid-May. But the Carters didn't wait. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, while Ethan was running errands and Sophie was at school, the Carters arrived unannounced. They spoke with the school's front office, presenting documents from their lawyer stating they were Sophie's legal parents. Claiming it was an emergency family situation, they took her, without consulting Ethan, without calling Amanda, without letting Sophie say goodbye. By the time Ethan returned home and received the frantic call from Ms. Ramirez, it was already happening. Sophie was on her way to the airport.
Ethan drove like a man possessed.
He barely stopped for lights, barely breathed as he sped toward Portland International Airport. Amanda called him 3 times. She was already filing an emergency motion with the court, but it might not reach the system fast enough to stop the Carters from boarding that flight. When he reached the terminal, the departure board told him what he already feared, Flight 684 to Paris, boarding at Gate 12. He ran. Pushed through security with a copy of the stay order Amanda had sent to his phone, argued with a TSA agent, pleaded with the gate agent. I just need to talk to her. 1 minute. Please.
A supervisor cam ouvert. Scanned the document.
Looked at Ethan. Nodded. We'll hold the gate. But you've got 2 minutes. That's it. He ran down the corridor, heart pounding, breath ragged. Gate 12 came into view. And there she was. Sophie stood beside her parents, her small figure dwarfed by a suitcase and her mother's hand on her shoulder. Her face was pale, her expression distant. Ethan stopped a few feet away.
Sophie.
She turned. Her eyes widened. She broke free from her mother's grasp.
Ran. Straight into Ethan's arms.
The hug wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. A small girl clinging to the only person who'd stayed. A man holding on like letting go would break him.
En sommeon filmed it.
Within hours, the video was online. A blurry clip titled Little Girl Runs to Man Who Raised Her at Airport went viral. On Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, comments flooded in. Let her choose. Blood doesn't make a father. This made me cry in the middle of work. Amanda arrived shortly after. The court order, now processed, officially blocked the Carters from removing Sophie from the state. Airport security escorted the Carters from the terminal. There was shouting. There were threats. But Sophie stayed with Ethan. That night, back at home, the house was quiet again. But this time, the silence was peaceful. Ethan sat on the porch, sipping tea. Sophie joined him, wrapped in her favorite hoodie, her hair still damp from the rain. They didn't even say goodbye, she said. They thought they didn't need to. I don't think they see me. Not really. Ethan looked at her.
What do you see when you look at yourself?
She thought for a long moment. I see someone who made it. Someone who shouldn't have, but did. He nodded. That's what I see too. She leaned against his arm. Thank you for running. Any time, he whispered. Later that night, Sophie opened her notebook and began to write, not equations this time, but words. A letter. To the judge.
To the world.
To herself. In it she said,
I know who I am not because of where I was born or who shares my DNA. I know who I am because of the person who stayed when it would have been easier to leave. I'm not asking to be rescued. I'm asking to be heard. It wasn't long. Just a page and a half. But it was enough. By morning, the internet was still talking about the video. National news picked it up. A hashtag began to trend, hashtag Let Sophie Choose. And for the first time since the day she'd walked into Ethan's life, Sophie Carter wasn't just a name on a missing persons report or a headline in a paper. She was a voice. And people were finally listening. The hearing was set for a Monday morning at the Multnomah County Courthouse. The gray stone building loomed against the early Portland sky, its cold exterior a stark contrast to the emotion boiling beneath its walls. Inside, the courtroom was filled with reporters, advocates, curious citizens, and more than a few quiet spectators who had followed the story online. Sophie arrived with Ethan and Amanda, her hair braided neatly, wearing a navy blue dress and her scuffed sneakers. She held nothing in her hands but a folded letter, the same one she had written the night after the airport. Her backpack was slung over one shoulder, worn at the seams, its contents carefully selected, a notebook, a small Rubik's Cube, and the calculator Ethan had given her the day he first tested her math skills. The Carters were already seated across the room, dressed in matching tones of gray and beige. They looked composed, but tension clung to them like a shadow. Their attorney, polished and efficient, flipped through documents and whispered instructions. Judge Catherine Lynn entered the courtroom promptly at 9 a.m. She was known for her fairness, her sharp mind, and her unwillingness to tolerate theatrics. The room rose as she entered, then sat again as she signaled for the hearing to begin.
Amanda stood first.
Your Honor, she began, this is not a custody battle in the traditional sense. This is about a 12-year-old girl, Sophie Carter, who, after surviving 7 years in the margins of society, has finally found stability, identity, and a home. We are not denying her biological connection to the petitioners. What we are asking is that this court allow Sophie's voice to be the one that matters most. Not history.
No deadline.
Not blood. But her own wishes. Judge Lynn nodded. And is Sophie prepared to speak on her own behalf? She is, Your Honor. The judge looked to the other side. Counsel for the petitioners? The Carters' attorney stood. Your Honor, Jacob and Marissa Carter are the biological parents of this child. They have spent years searching for her, investing time, resources, and emotional energy. Their only desire is to reunite with their daughter and give her the life she deserves. They are not villains. They are parents. Ethan clenched his jaw. He wanted to stand to speak, but Amanda gently placed a hand on his arm. Wait. Judge Lynn turned to Sophie.
Sophie, are you ready?
She nodded.
Yes, ma'am.
The courtroom fell silent as she walked to the center. A microphone had been set at her height. She stood straight, her hands holding the folded letter, her voice calm but clear. When I was little, she began, I had a family. I don't remember much about it. Just pieces. A cat named Pluto. The way the hallway smelled.
My mom crying in the kitchen.
I don't know why I left, or how it all really fell apart. I only know that one day I was alone.
She paused.
For a long time, I thought that was how it had to be. I thought I didn't matter. I thought being smart was the only thing that made me worth anything. I taught myself math not because I loved it, at first, but because it was the only thing that made sense. She unfolded the letter and read. I don't want to be a prize. I don't want to be something that was lost and then claimed. I want to be a person. I want to be seen. And I want to choose where I grow. Where I learn.
Who we trust.
She looked up at the judge. I'm not saying I hate my parents. I'm not even saying I don't want to know them. But I am saying that right now, I belong with Ethan. He didn't ask for me. He didn't expect me. But he stayed. And he gave me the space to be myself. The judge watched her, expression unreadable. Thank you, Sophie, she said. Sophie stepped back, returning to her seat beside Ethan. He gave her a small nod, his throat tight. The Carters' attorney requested a recess before rebuttal. Judge Lynn granted 10 minutes. During the break, the courtroom buzzed with quiet voices. Sophie leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder.
He placed a hand gently on her back. I'm proud of you, he said. I was scared, she whispered. You didn't look it. I was. But I wasn't alone. When the hearing resumed, the Carters chose not to testify. Their attorney delivered a closing statement, emphasizing their love for their daughter, their readiness to support her future, and their willingness to cooperate with whatever decision the court made. Amanda, in her final words, said only this. Sophie Carter found her voice.
Let's not silence it now.
Judge Lynn asked for the courtroom to be cleared. A decision would be delivered within the hour. Ethan and Sophie waited outside, sitting on a bench near the courthouse lawn. Amanda paced quietly nearby, checking her phone. Sophie scribbled in her notebook, not math this time, just words. When the doors reopened, Judge Lynn delivered her ruling. In consideration of the unique circumstances, the child's expressed wishes, and the documented history provided, this court grants joint legal custody of Sophie Carter to both parties, with primary physical custody to remain with Ethan Miller. Gasps echoed through the room. Sophie closed her eyes. The judge continued. The Carters are granted structured visitation, with ongoing evaluation to determine the child's comfort and safety. At the age of 14, Sophie will have the legal right to petition for full autonomy in her living arrangements. Jacob Carter stood, but said nothing. Marissa wiped a tear, her face softening, almost relieved.
Amanda Chouk est naissante, her eyes bright.
Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered. Microphones were shoved forward. Cameras flashed. Someone asked Sophie how she felt. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she pulled out her calculator, tapped a few buttons, and showed the screen.
1 = 1. The reporter blinked.
What does that mean? She smiled. It means I get to be whole. On my terms. That clip went viral too. But by the time it hit 1 million views, Sophie was back home, curled on the couch with her notebook and a cup of hot cocoa. Ethan sat nearby, sorting through mail, pretending not to watch her. You okay? He asked.
Better than okay.
Scared. A little. But still you. She nodded. Still me. The hearing was over. The noise would fade. But her voice, once found, wouldn't be silenced again. She had chosen. And for the first time in her life, no one could take that away. It had been almost a year since the courtroom doors closed behind them. In that time, Sophie Carter had grown, not just in inches, though she'd shot up nearly 3 in 6 months, but in the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, the way she faced the world. She still loved math, still solved complex problems with a sharpness that amazed even her new teachers, but now, numbers were just one part of her story. The rest? That was unfolding every day. She remained in Portland, enrolled in a public magnet school for gifted students. It wasn't the private academy the Carters had pushed for, but it was hers, chosen with Ethan, where she felt free to ask questions no one had answers to. She had joined a debate team, not because she loved arguing, but because she realized her voice could be more than just defense. It could be a tool.
À force.
Ethan had gone back to work part-time, helping with digital marketing for a non-profit. He kept the house mostly the same, except for the small study he converted into Sophie's workspace, bookshelves on every wall, a bean bag in the corner, and a corkboard filled with her goals, test scores, and clippings from her competition wins. On the top, pinned carefully, was the letter she had read in court. She didn't read it often anymore. She didn't have to. The Carters kept in touch. Their relationship had grown slowly, awkward at times, but not without effort. They visited once a month, mostly on weekends, sometimes for a walk, a dinner, or a quiet afternoon in the park. Jacob had softened, though he still carried his rigidity like armor. Marissa brought books, listened more than she spoke, and occasionally asked Sophie questions she once might have avoided. One Sunday afternoon, after a visit, Sophie sat with Ethan on the back porch. The sun was warm on her face, and the scent of blooming lavender drifted from the garden. They're trying, she said. I can see that. But I still don't feel like I come from them. You don't have to. Sometimes the people we come from aren't the people we grow with. She nodded, letting that sink in. What about you? She asked. Do you think about leaving?
Going back to your old life.
Ethan looked out at the trees lining the street, their leaves turning gold and red with the season.
Sometimes, he said honestly. There's a version of me in another life who stayed in the city, kept chasing titles, tried to rebuild everything he lost.
And il a existe version better.
Why? Because this version gets to make pancakes on Saturdays. And loses arguments about bedtime. And lives in a house that's always a little too loud, a little too messy, but never empty.
She smiled. Good answer.
In the spring, Sophie entered the National Math Invitational in D.C. Ethan traveled with her. It was the first time she'd flown on a plane since that day at the airport. She gripped the armrest a little tighter during takeoff, but when Ethan looked over with concern, she just said, "I'm fine," and meant it. At the competition, she didn't just win. She broke the record for youngest contestant to reach the final round. A panelist called her the future of problem-solving. But Sophie, standing at the podium during her acceptance, didn't talk about math. She talked about belonging. She told the audience about a man who offered her a blanket and a peanut butter cracker on a rainy day. About a woman named Ms. Ramirez who told her she was more than numbers. About a courtroom where she finally got to choose. About how being seen mattered more than being saved. The audience gave her a standing ovation.
When she walked off the stage, she found Ethan waiting in the wings.
You killed it, he said. I didn't cry this time. I almost did. She laughed.
The next morning, a reporter from a national magazine asked if she would ever consider publishing a memoir someday.
I don't think I'm done living it yet, she answered.
Summer came. Then fall again.
Sophie turned 13 with a backyard party that included Ms. Ramirez, Amanda Price, her math coach, and a few classmates from school who had become her first real group of friends. The Carters sent a gift, a bracelet with a small planet charm, a nod to Pluto, the cat she could barely remember but had never quite forgotten. After the guests left, Ethan handed her a small envelope. Inside was a copy of an old photo, one taken the day she won her first local competition. She stood beside him on their porch, holding a trophy half her size, her hair wild and her smile unsure. On the back, he had written one sentence.
The day you remanded me écoutes-tu start over.
She looked up at him. You know, she said, if you ever decide to write a book, I'd read it. Only if you promise to help me edit it. Deal.
That night, they sat together on the porch, listening to the quiet hum of the city settling in for sleep.
Sophie leaned against his shoulder. Do you ever wonder how all this happened? She asked.
Like the chance?
Me walking down your street that day. I think about it all the time, he said. And I still don't know how the universe got it right. I used to believe I was a problem to solve.
You're not.
I know that now.
They watched a plane pass overhead, its blinking lights moving steadily across the night sky.
I don't want to forget who I was, she said. But I'm glad I'm not her anymore. You never lost her, Ethan said. You just gave her a better ending. She closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, but because she finally could.
Sophie Carter, once lost, once invisible, was no longer a whisper in someone else's story.
She was her own voice. And the world was listening.